My father spent 40 years building the finest violin restoration workshop in the state, one instrument at a time. The week he died, his longtime apprentice quietly began replacing our workshop's finest pieces with convincing fakes and selling the originals through a private gallery 2 towns over. It took me 4 months to prove it, and one night, wearing a suit that wasn't mine and a name that didn't exist, to actually catch him. I want to tell you about my father first, because you won't understand what it cost me to do what I eventually did without understanding what he actually built. His name was Elias, and he restored string instruments, violins, cellos, the occasional viola, out of a converted barn behind our house that smelled permanently of varnish, spruce shavings, and the particular dust that only decades of careful, patient work can produce. He wasn't famous outside a fairly narrow world, but inside that world, among orchestras and serious collectors and a handful of people who actually understand what makes one violin worth $4,000 and another worth $400,000, his name meant something close to reverence. He could look at a damaged instrument that 3 other restorers had already given up on and, over the course of months, sometimes years, bring it back to something close to what its maker had originally intended. I grew up in that barn. I learned to sand a scroll before I learned to drive. I remember, specifically being maybe 9 years old, watching him hold a cracked instrument up to a window for 20 straight minutes without saying a word, and asking him what he was doing, and him saying, without looking away from the wood, listening to what it wants to become again. I didn't understand that sentence for another 15 years. I'm not sure I fully understand it now. Victor Kessler came to my father as an apprentice when I was 11 years old. He was 24 then, talented in the specific, hungry way young craftsmen sometimes are, and my father took to him immediately, treated him within a couple of years, less like an employee and more like the son who'd shown an actual gift for the family trade, since I, by my teens, had made it clear I loved the workshop but had no real talent for the delicate handwork itself. I remember, without much bitterness even now, the particular quality of my father's voice when he talked about Victor's work at family dinners, a warmth and pride he never quite used the same way when talking about my own, more ordinary contributions to the business side. I didn't resent Victor for it as a teenager. If anything, I was relieved someone existed who could give my father the specific kind of satisfaction his craft demanded, since I clearly wasn't going to be that person myself. Victor stayed for 15 years. He became, by any outside measure, my father's full partner in every way except the paperwork, co-signing the biggest restoration contracts, representing the workshop at trade events my father's failing knees could no longer handle, standing beside my father at my mother's funeral 8 years ago like a second son, his hand on my father's shoulder in a photograph I still have. A photograph I found myself unable to look at for months after everything I eventually learned. I want you to understand that I am not describing a stranger who slipped something past us. I am describing a man my entire family trusted completely, for a decade and a half, with almost no reservation at all. My father died in March of a heart attack in the workshop at 73, with a violin's F-hole still half carved on the bench in front of him. I inherited the business, the barn, the tools, the client relationships, and though I didn't fully understand this for months, a small but genuinely valuable collection of restored instruments my father had kept over the decades, as both inventory and a kind of quiet personal pride, pieces too fine to casually sell, worth collectively somewhere in the high 6 figures. I'm not my father. I want to be honest about that up front, because it matters to how easily Victor was able to do what he did. I can restore an instrument competently. My father made sure of that. But I don't have as I, the specific trained instinct that lets you look at a 100-year-old violin and know, in seconds, whether the varnish is original or a very good modern imitation. Victor has that eye. It's the reason my father trusted him with everything. It's also I would learn the exact skill he used to rob us. The first thing I noticed, about 6 weeks after the funeral, was small enough that I nearly dismissed it. A violin my father had restored years earlier for a private collector, a beautiful, mid-1800s French piece he'd talked about with real affection at family dinners, came back to us for a minor adjustment, and something about it felt wrong to me in a way I couldn't articulate. Not the sound, which was fine. Something about the grain of the wood near the scroll, a pattern I remembered my father pointing out to me once as unusually distinctive. I mentioned it to Victor, half joking, saying it looked different than I remembered. He laughed it off, told me memory plays tricks on people, especially grieving ones, and I let it go because I trusted him, and because grief genuinely does play tricks on people, and I had no real reason yet to believe otherwise. The pattern, once I started actually looking for it instead of dismissing it, took shape faster than I expected. Over the following 2 months, I quietly went through every major piece in what I'd started thinking of as my father's private collection, cross-referencing them against old photographs, appraisal documents, and insurance records my mother had meticulously kept for decades. Evenings and weekends spent alone in the barn with a desk lamp and a growing stack of manila folders, comparing decade-old photographs against the instruments in front of me with a magnifying glass my father had used for the same purpose his entire career, feeling, more than once, like I was somehow betraying his memory just by suspecting the man he'd trusted most. For instruments, all of them among the most valuable in the collection, showed the same kind of subtle inconsistency I'd first noticed. Details that didn't quite match older documentation, tiny variations in aging or construction that felt, the more I looked, less like memory playing tricks and more like the work of someone skilled enough to make a very good copy of my father's own restorations. I remember the specific, sick feeling of finding the third one, a cello my father had restored for university orchestra years earlier, and realizing this was no longer a single unfortunate coincidence, but a pattern with a shape and a direction. I confronted Victor directly, in the workshop, on a rainy afternoon in June. I laid out what I'd found, as calmly as I could manage, spreading the old photographs and appraisal documents across my father's own workbench, the same bench where Victor had learned half of what he knew. I asked him to explain it, watching his face carefully the entire time, looking for some flicker I could point to later and say, that was the moment I knew. There wasn't one. His face did the same steady, patient thing it had always done when a difficult client questioned his work. A slight furrow, a slow nod, the visual language of a man taking a concern seriously. He didn't deny knowing the instruments were valuable, or deny handling most of them personally in the months before my father's death. He couldn't, since the restoration logs were in his own handwriting. But he denied, completely and convincingly, doing anything to them beyond the documented restoration work. He suggested, gently and with what looked like real concern, that I was struggling with grief and control after losing both my parents, and that seeing patterns in old paperwork was, respectfully, a common way for people to cope with a loss they couldn't otherwise process. He even put a hand on my shoulder before he left that afternoon, the exact gesture I remembered from the funeral photograph, and told me to take some time off, that the business would still be there when I was ready. I left that conversation half convinced he was right, and I was the one losing my grip. I actually apologized to him on his way out the door. I think about that apology more than almost anything else in this story. It was a client who finally cracked it open for me 3 weeks later. A longtime collector, a semi-retired orchestra conductor named Mrs. Albright, who'd been buying and consigning instruments through my father for over 20 years, called me with a strange, almost apologetic question. She'd seen, at a small private gallery 2 towns over, a gallery I'd never heard of, run by a name I also didn't recognize at the time, a violin she was almost certain was one my father had restored for her late husband's estate years earlier, being offered for sale at a price nearly triple what she'd been told it was worth when it sold out of our workshop the previous autumn, in a sale Victor had personally handled while I was still learning the business side. She sent me a photograph from the gallery's private catalog. It was, unmistakably, the instrument. I drove to that gallery myself the next day, under my own name, as a grieving son, simply asking questions about his father's old client relationships, and I learned 2 things that changed everything. First, the gallery's owner of record was a name I didn't recognize, but the person actually running the private appointments, the person Mrs. Albright, and, it turned out at least 2 other former clients had personally dealt with, was Victor, operating under a business name that traced back, through a chain of paperwork I only partially understood at the time, to a shell entity he'd quietly registered 11 months before my father died. Second, and more chilling, the gallery's private inventory. The pieces shown only to serious, vetted collectors by appointment, not the pieces on public display, appear to include several instruments that matched, item for item, the gaps I'd started finding in my father's collection. I took what I had to a lawyer, and then, at the lawyer's suggestion, to the police. Both conversations ended roughly the same way. The lawyer told me that proving provenance fraud and asset diversion against a skilled craftsman who'd done the actual documented restoration work himself, using circumstantial photographic comparisons and a grieving family suspicion, would likely take years of expensive litigation, discovery, and expert testimony, with no guarantee of a result. All while our actual working business continued losing clients who were quietly drifting toward Victor's new gallery instead. The detective I spoke with, a tired, not unkind man named Officer Duarte, told me plainly that without something more concrete than, "I think this violin looks different than I remember," his department had neither the specialized expertise nor the resources to pursue what would likely be classified, in the end, as a civil dispute between business partners rather than a criminal matter. "Give me something I can actually hold in my hand," he said, "and I'll move on it same day. Right now, I've got a grieving man's memory against a respected craftsman's paperwork." I want to be honest that I sat with that advice for almost 2 weeks, genuinely unsure what to do with it, before I landed on the plan that eventually worked. I am not, by nature, the kind of person who invents a false identity and walks into a stranger's business under it. But Officer Duarte's sentence kept repeating in my head, "Give me something I can actually hold in my hand," and I realized that the one place Victor would show his real inventory, unguarded, was the one place I could never walk in as myself, because he would simply show me the same polished nothing he'd shown me the day I confronted him. So I became someone else. I spent 3 weeks building a persona I genuinely still feel strange describing. I created an email address and a simple, professional-looking website for a fictional private collector named Nathaniel Voss, a semi-anonymous investor from out of state with, according to the biography I wrote for him, a recently developed interest in fine-string instruments as an alternative asset class, vague enough to sound plausible to someone eager for a large sale, specific enough to sound like real money. I spent an embarrassing number of evenings on that website alone, agonizing over details like a fake previous address and a vague, unverifiable mention of a small portfolio of impressionist works meant to signal old, quiet money without inviting anyone to actually check. I borrowed a suit from a friend who worked in finance, the kind of understated gray that photographs like money without announcing itself, and I rehearsed a handful of basic facts about instrument investing I'd learned from actual industry publications, so I wouldn't immediately expose myself as a fraud the moment Victor asked a real question. The difference between a violin's back and belly wood, the rough price trajectory of Italian instruments from the Golden Period, small, correct sounding, fragments of a world I'd grown up in, but never formally studied the business of. I reached out to the gallery requesting a private appointment to view their finest available pieces, mentioning, carefully, a budget large enough to guarantee I'd be shown the real inventory, rather than the display room. The reply came back within a day, warm and professional, from an email address I didn't recognize, signed only VK, Private Client Services, a small, sour detail that told me, before I'd even seen him in person, exactly how thoroughly he'd rebuilt his own identity around this theft. The appointment was set for a Thursday evening, after the gallery's public hours. I remember sitting in my car outside, in the rain, for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go in, running through every way this could go wrong. Victor recognizing my voice despite the different name. Victor asking a technical question specific enough to unravel me in front of the one person who'd actually know I was lying. I had a small recording device in my jacket pocket, borrowed from the same friend who'd lent me the suit, and I remember my hand shaking slightly as I checked, one more time, that it was actually running. Victor greeted Mr. Voss at the door himself, warm and professional in exactly the way I'd watched him be warm and professional with real clients my entire adolescence. And for one disorienting moment, walking into that private back room behind the gallery's public showroom, I felt less like an investigator and more like a boy watching his father's protege do the job beautifully, the way he'd always done it. He shook my hand with both of his, the way he'd shaken 100 client hands in front of me over the years, and complimented the suit I borrowed, and asked Mr. Voss easy, comfortable questions about the flight in, questions I'd rehearsed answers for so many times in my car that they came out of me smoother than I had any right to expect. My own heart was going hard enough that I genuinely worried, for a moment, that he'd be able to see it through my jacket. Then he opened a locked cabinet, and I saw, laid out under careful gallery lighting, For violins I recognized immediately, down to the specific grain patterns I'd once thought I was imagining out of grief. I made myself walk toward them slowly, the way I imagined an actual wealthy stranger would, rather than crossing the room the way every instinct in my body wanted to, which was at a dead run. I asked him, in the flat, careful voice I'd practiced in my car for 3 weeks, where a collection this fine had come from. And Victor, confident, relaxed, talking to a wealthy stranger rather than a suspicious, grieving son, told me. He told me, at length, about a recently deceased master restorer whose family, in his words, didn't fully understand or appreciate what they'd inherited, and about how he'd been able to responsibly relocate several key pieces to serious collectors who would actually value them properly. He specifically, unprompted, described the provenance of the exact French violin I'd first noticed 6 weeks earlier, giving a version of its history that quietly, casually erased my father's name from an instrument my father had spent 4 months of his final year lovingly restoring, attributing the restoration instead, with a small, practiced modesty, to our workshop. He named a price for the collection that was, by my own later calculation, nearly 3 times what those instruments had ever been valued at under my father's honest appraisals. He picked up the French violin at one point, turned it under the light with the exact same reverent, unhurried motion I'd watched my father use my entire childhood, and I had to look away for a second, toward the wall, and pretend to be examining a photograph so he wouldn't see whatever my face was doing. And buried in an entry from the year I turned 12, written only weeks after that first wallet incident, I found the sentence that I now understand was the true beginning of all of it. He'd written, simply, "A boy returned a stranger's wallet today with more money in it than his own family likely sees in a month, and told the concession stand attendant he didn't want a reward. I want to know if that boy is real, or if he's a fluke, the way I once believed a business partner's decency was real. I intend to find out, patiently, for as long as it takes." Beneath that entry, in different ink, added years later, he'd written a single additional line I didn't find until my 3rd pass through the journal. 17 now. Stayed for a friend. Still real. I don't fully know why I was the one he picked to start with. Out of however many small moments of decency happen in the world in any given year that nobody ever notices or tracks. I've come to believe, reading his journals, that it wasn't really about me specifically at all, not at first. It was about him needing, after being so completely wrong about one person, to find out whether he could still trust his own judgment about people in general. I happened to be the test case he started with. I simply never stopped being one for 20 years without ever knowing it. I inherited, in the end, a house I will probably never live in, a modest but real fortune I'm still working out how to think about responsibly, and a stack of journals from a man I never met who nonetheless knew more continuous, careful detail about my character than almost anyone who has ever actually loved me. I used a portion of it, in the first year, to quietly do the one thing I felt certain Arthur himself would have approved of, given everything I now understood about how he'd spent his life. I found, through Ms. Patterson's careful, discreet research, Toby, the friend whose blame I'd once accepted at 17 for a broken cabinet door that wasn't mine, now a struggling single father 3 states away, working 2 jobs and falling slowly behind on a mortgage he'd taken on with more hope than security. I helped him, anonymously, the way I'd once been helped by a man I never met, with a real amount of cash and an unsigned note. I didn't tell him it was me. I didn't sign a name, the same way none had ever been signed to me. And standing at that mailbox, I understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself feel until that exact moment, the strange, patient loneliness Arthur must have carried for 30 years, watching from just outside a life he decided never to actually enter. I didn't do it to close some cosmic loop. I did it because it was, by that point, simply the shape my life had already been quietly bent into by a stranger's patient attention, whether I'd known it or not. It's raining tonight, the same kind of steady, unremarkable rain that was falling the Thursday I drove 3 states over to hear a stranger explain 20 years of my own life back to me. I keep one of Arthur's journal pages framed on my desk now. Not the will, not the final note, but the very first entry, the one about the boy and the wallet, written by a man who had every reason in the world to believe people were simply not to be trusted, and who decided, instead, to spend 3 decades patiently checking. I think about the 11 of us sometimes, the 10 I'll likely never meet, whose ordinary, mixed human choices Arthur watched with the same careful attention he gave mine, and who never got the phone call I got. Not because they were bad people, but because most people, turns out, are simply human in the specific, forgivable way Arthur wasn't quite able to forgive after what happened to him. I think, too, about the strange mercy underneath the harshness of his project. That even the 3 who failed were never publicly named, never confronted, never made to feel the weight of the test they didn't know they'd taken. Arthur simply, quietly, stopped watching and let them keep whatever peace came from never knowing. There's a kindness buried even in that. I've come to think, though it took me a long time to see it, as anything other than cold. I still get envelopes, in a way. Not from Arthur, obviously. But every March now, without fail, I sit down and write one myself, to someone I've noticed, quietly, doing the harder and more honest thing when nobody was checking. A cashier who chased down a customer over an accidental undercharge. A teenager at a gas station who returned a lost phone with the screen still lit up on someone else's messages. Unread. I don't sign them either. I've come to understand, in a way I never could have before that Thursday in the rain, exactly why Arthur never let himself get close enough to find out how his money landed. Some kindnesses only stay honest if you never get to see what they cost the person receiving them, or what they mean. If there's a single thing I've taken from all of this, it's not really about the money, and it's not really about Arthur Lowell. Whatever else I've come to understand about the particular grief that shaped his whole strange, quiet second half of a life. It's this. You will almost certainly never know, in the moment, which small, unglamorous choice to do the harder and more honest thing is the one someone, somewhere, is quietly keeping score of. Most of the time, probably no one is watching at all. But every once in a while, for 20 years, someone is.